Hello and welcome to Alita Dogma's Shades of Murder, a podcast where I will share and discuss tales of true crime, mysteries, and all things dark and macabre. If you eat plain dream and shades of murder like me, well, welcome, my kindred spirits, to your new podcast home. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and subscribe, share, and consider a 5-star rating so I may present more stories to you. And we can all embrace the love, the darkness together. All of my contact information you can find in the episode description below. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case and may not be intended for all audiences. This is a special Halloween episode devoted to witches in the past and present day. Witches have been portrayed in countless interpretations of literature, film, plays, and shows over the centuries as being predominantly one of two different types of women. One tends to be a deformed, unattractive, crone-like woman, often wearing a long black dress and a tall pointed hat. She is frequently accompanied by a black cat and is portrayed as someone who casts evil spells upon the innocents, which she brews inside a large black cauldron. The other is depicted as a dark seductress, a beautiful woman, typically youthful and alluring, who is too tempting for any man to resist. And she cannot be trusted. Both are negative representations of women that were concocted by the patriarchy in their continuous attempt to paint us in a derogatory light and keep us in our place. This imagery is nothing new, as it was created and utilized to help ignite and justify the witch trials from the 15th through the 17th century throughout Europe and America. It may sound preposterous to some, ridiculous, and a form of extreme feminism to others, but there is a strong historical connection between sexism, capitalism, and witchcraft. This has been revealed by several historical researchers, both female and male, regarding the origin and true intentions behind the witch trials of the 15th century. It has been noted by historians that several factors played into the manifestation of the witch trials, from economic strife, famine, poverty, the rise in Christianity, and an increase in technology. In particular, the ability to print images that iconized the image of the female witch. These were some of the primary elements that helped to bring about this period of persecution. Sexism, of course, did not poof into existence during the 15th century, but with the rise of capitalism also surfaced the establishment of the patriarchy. It sought to rip women of any social power and effectively silence their roles and thus their voices. We can see this to be true since the centuries before capitalism existed. There were women who were extremely powerful throughout the ages and across many different cultures. There is no more infamous woman in history who was persecuted and murdered for the allegations of witchcraft made against her than that of Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc. Jeanne d'Arc has been a personal heroine of mine since I was a young girl. Strangely, it was not because I watched the black and white film in a high school literature class. I saw the film Legend of Billie Jean, which was a fictional movie in the mid-1980s, starring a very young Christian Slater and Helen Slater, who played the title character in the film. The synopsis of the film is that this young woman, Billie Jean, is sexually assaulted by a local gang member where she lives in a small Texas town. Her younger brother ends up accidentally killing her perpetrator, which forces them to have to go on the run. They are hunted down by law enforcement, and by fate, or rather her destiny, Billie Jean happens to catch the old black and white film which portrays Joan of Arc, playing on a motel TV. The movie, and more importantly, the character of Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc, speaks to her and empowers her on levels she never knew were possible. Watching this film inspired me to watch and read everything I could find on Joan of Arc when I was a young girl. She has been a source of inspiration to me a muse, and a historical role model ever since. The story of Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc, is beyond legendary, especially in France and throughout the Catholic Church. She was not just a legend, though, but very much a real young woman who was the primary reason behind the successful victory of many battles, and hence the eventual liberation of France from England. This young woman, who became the savior of France through her leadership and divine guidance of the French army, found herself abandoned to face the wrath of the English once she was captured. Her visions, which provided the French government and its military leaders with the information necessary for victory, backfired on her, and they were used against her to accuse her of heresy, witchcraft, and for her violation of the divine laws of dressing like the opposite gender. It has been suggested by many feminists and historians alike that it was her position and masculine image in society, in addition to her rebellion against the Catholic Church at the time, which ultimately led her to being persecuted and murdered. An illiterate peasant girl, Jeanne d'Arc, was born in 1412 and raised in a small village in northeastern France called Domremy, by her father, who was a tenant farmer, and her mother, who was a devout Catholic. Something unique and special, perhaps even a bit strange, was inside young Jeanne. At only 12 or 13 years old, she began to hear voices and see visions of various saints, including St. Michael, St. Catherine of Alexandria, and St. Margaret of Antioch. These saints told her that it was her mission, her destiny, to help make Charles, who was the Dauphin at the time, which is the oldest son of the king, the next king of France, so that the invading English could be halted. At 16 years old, she sought out the Dauphin Charles by traveling to the captain of the garrison, where she shared with him the visions she had been sent. Jeanne was initially sent away, but when she returned 8 months later, this time, he listened to her. The next month, along with a company of 6 soldiers, Jeanne, dressed like a man, rode to the Dauphin's castle at Chinon, where she had been given the chance to speak to the Dauphin Charles. Over several weeks, she remained there, questioned by theologians regarding her visions. And at the end of this period, they all encouraged Charles to listen to the bizarre, yet enigmatic, young girl. Charles provided Jeanne with a small army to command, and on April 27, 1429, she rode to Orleans, which the English had held for more than a year prior. Bearing supplies and reinforcements, she spoke to the soldiers, who became inspired by her words and, no doubt, her mystical presence. She helped to ignite in them a fiery resistance to the English rule and personally led the charge in several battles. On May 7th, Jeanne was struck by an arrow, dressed her wound the best they could, and continued on in battle, which the French were victorious in that day. The next day, the French army had taken back Orleans. These victories would accumulate over the next 5 weeks, as Jeanne and the French commanders beat the English in battle after battle. Then on July 16th, the royal army reached Reims, which opened up its gates to both Jeanne and Charles, who would be crowned King Charles VII the next day. Jeanne was there for the ceremony, holding the Christ and Judgment painting she was now known for always having on her person. In early September, Jeanne d'Arc joined the newly appointed king in battle, attacking Paris, calling upon the people to surrender its city to King Charles. But she was unsuccessful. That same year, Jeanne led several more battles which ended in victory for France. Then at the end of the year, the king ennobled, that is, he granted nobility to Jeanne, her parents, and her brothers. Within the same month, while leading a defense in Compiègne, she stayed behind and was caught and incarcerated by the Duke of Burgundy. They sold her to the English, who held her in jail for over a year before her trial would commence on January 9th, 1431. The opening words from the prosecution, who were the ecclesiastical authorities, aka the church's clergymen, have been reported to be as follows. The report has now become well known in many places that this woman, utterly disregarding what is honorable in the female sex, breaking the bounds of modesty, and forgetting all female decency, has disgracefully put on the clothing of the male sex, a striking and vile monstrosity, and what is more, her presumption went so far that she dared to do, say, and disseminate many things beyond and contrary to the Catholic faith, and injurious to the articles of its orthodox belief. Second only to being questioned about these voices that commanded her to help Charles VII, Jeanne d'Arc was grilled endlessly for why she desired to be dressed like a man. Jeanne allegedly claimed that while imprisoned and forced to wear women's clothing, she was assaulted multiple times by the English, but when surrounded by men, she felt it was more proper to wear their clothing so as to defend her modesty. Jeanne was known to be notoriously feisty, temperamental, and even sassy. No one was too above their status to be called out for swearing, skipping mass, dismissing her battle strategies, and being cowards, especially the noblest of men and most prestigious of knights. Allegedly, she ran off with her sword mistresses and prostitutes that traveled along with her soldiers. During her trial, when inquired by a clergyman who held a particularly strong regional accent as to in what language her voices spoke to her, she facetiously replied that they spoke far better French than he did. Jeanne d'Arc was found to be guilty by 27 trial masters of hearing voices of the divine, which under Catholic law would only be allowed to be received by someone of a divine stature, such as a priest or a bishop, not a common person, and for adorning the clothes which were assigned to the male gender. Jeanne d'Arc was given two choices. Either she repented to save her life, or she would be given death. On May 24th, 1431, she heartbreakingly felt like she had no other choice but to repent, and if she promised to dress like a woman, the church informed her that her penalty instead would be life imprisonment. However, some divine force, or maybe her own self-respect and ferocious will, drove Jeanne's actions once more, and again she claimed to have visions. She also promptly returned to dressing like a man. She alleged that St. Catherine and St. Margaret had visited her and reprimanded her for giving in to the demands of the church. So she decided to obey the saints over the church instead. This time, all 27 trial masters declared her to be an unrepentant heretic and turned her over to the secular court to face the ultimate punishment for her crimes. On May 30th, 1431, in the English-dominated town of Place des Vieux Marches en Ruine, the 19-year-old heroine of France was burned at the stake. The last words that were spoken to this young savior before she was murdered by the English and their French cohorts were, and I quote, "We say and determine that you have falsely imagined revelations and divine apparitions, that you are a pernicious temptress, presumptuous, credulous, rash, superstitious, a false prophetess, a blasphemer against God and his saints, scornful of God in his sacraments, a transgressor of divine law, sacred doctrine, and ecclesiastical decrees, that you are seditious, cruel, apostate, schismatic, straying in many ways from our faith, and that in these ways you have rashly sinned against God and his church." Before they lit the pyre beneath her feet, she asked a priest to hold a crucifix up for her to look at, and to shout out prayers loud enough so that she could hear them over the screaming of the flames that surrounded her. However, Jeanne d'Arc did not burn alive, rather she died from smoke inhalation. So allegedly, the Cardinal of Winchester ordered Jeanne to be burnt again. When some of her organs remained intact, specifically her heart, which lay amazingly unburnt, after the second burning, he again ordered that her body be burnt for a third time, so that nothing of her flesh and bones remained. The ashes which lay behind were thrown into the river Seine. It would not be until 1450 that the girl who sacrificed everything for her country and who was the primary reason Charles had become the King of France would be declared not guilty in a rehabilitation trial that was commanded by King Charles VII. Why he did not intervene and attempt to save her life when she was faced with being burnt at the stake was never addressed. I would presume that is because the church was even above him, and there was nothing that could be done to prevent her murder. Either way, it is heartbreaking that she sacrificed her life for France, and no one did anything to halt this injustice. At least in return, she would become their greatest martyr. More than 450 years would pass before she was at last beatified. That is, she was made holy and sacred by the church in the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And then in 1920 she was declared a saint by Pope Benedict XV. Immortalized, and the source of countless poems, plays, and references in literature, film, and art, Jeanne d'Arc did not die in vain. She is the patron saint of France and was the national symbol during the 100 Years' War that the French fought against the English. To this day, she continues to be a symbol of that pride and is forever remembered as one of the world's greatest military leaders. To me, she is a symbol of a woman who refused to abide by the rules of the patriarchy and the church. A young woman who sacrificed her own life for the people of France and to remain true to her faith and her beliefs. The ultimate female rebel, Jeanne d'Arc fought against what was expected of her. She rejected the church's demands, and although incredibly short-lived, her life was filled with purpose and passion, set by her own terms. It cannot be a coincidence that after Jeanne d'Arc was persecuted and killed for going against the vein of what a woman was supposed to be engaged in and look like, other women who did not meet societal expectations were the targets of hatred, persecution, and murder. Her death seemed to have opened the floodgates of the patriarchy's premeditated and carefully calculated attack on women. Women who were in control of their own fates. Women of influence and power who were not dependent upon men were viewed as a threat to men's own power and influence. It has been recorded how in medieval Europe, the vast majority of women, as were their husbands, were serfs, and that they partook in many different tasks, including caring for their children, cooking, collecting herbs, helping with the livestock, and assisting in the harvesting of grains. With these grains, these women were the ones responsible for brewing beer, which at the time went far beyond the concept of enjoying an alcoholic beverage. Beer at this time was deemed a necessity for people's health and well-being, since it could help to protect them from the rampant diseases they could be infected with during this very unsanitary time in history. Women also had the option to become nuns, which at the time held great potential for political and social power and status. Those who were wed to kings and emperors, or who were monarchs themselves, also had strong and influential stations in life, and hence their voices were listened to and had far-reaching impacts. Toward the end of the 15th century, the burdens of illness, poverty, and war had taken their toll, especially on the men in society, and they looked at sources beyond what they could explain by nature or biology to find a root cause. The book, the Malleus Maleficarum, also commonly called the Hammer of Witches, was published by two Christian inquisitors in 1486, who placed the blame upon the pagan practitioners of Europe, specifically the witches, for the death, chaos, and disease that God had stricken upon the continent. A segment of its first paragraph describes how God has, and I quote, caused a certain unusual heretical perversity to grow up in the land of the Lord, a heresy, I say, of sorceress, since it is to be designated by the particular gender over which he is known to have power. The concept of witches being servants of Satan went against what mass society believed in at this time. Instead, communities often revered them as highly valuable members whom others turned to in simple matters, such as finding an item that mattered to them, healing ointments for their common ailment, or for spiritual guidance. These women had a more powerful and influential social status than the average serfs did in society, and this was not perceived as an issue until the fear of their connection with Lucifer was introduced. As a result, this caused widespread panic and terror amongst the everyday peasants, who established unorganized mobs to locate and hunt these women down. There were laws being passed, in particular in Germany at this time, which were solely aimed at murdering witches in order to seize the hysteria amongst the people. In Bavaria, there were purity laws passed whose goal was for the economic and health protection of the people. The women Brewsters were in direct violation of this law. It was recorded how these women adorned tall, pointy hats, with the purpose of people being able to find their shops amongst the heavy masses of people in the markets. Brooms were often placed outside their doors as a sign to the market-goers that they had beer brewing inside their large black coal cauldrons. Cats were also visible companions of these women, since they fed on the mice that attempted to destroy their grain supplies. Unfortunately, these women frequently added additional ingredients to their brews, which were against the new purity laws. For peasants, these women were doing very well for themselves, especially since the markets had expanded greatly since the Black Death epidemic, which had wiped out so much of Europe, and directly impacted the need and demand for brew. However, the levies against them, in addition to the principal grains which were mandated to be used under the purity laws, successfully forced many of these women out of the business. Then, men stepped in and took over as the brewmasters, since the market had expanded to the extent that they were now interested enough to prevent women from its involvement and make it into a very prosperous industry. Governments across Europe, especially in Britain, created ale taster posts to regulate the brew market. The English government began to hire men as its official government brewers from the Brewers Guild, who would then dominate the industry. For the few women who managed to sustain their small brewing operations, a final act of ostracization from the industry was performed by this same group of men. Thanks to the printing press and its far-reaching scope, pamphlets could now be distributed on a mass scale, with the iconic depiction of a witch in her black robe and pointy hat stirring a cauldron, thus making a direct impact on thousands. Women's popular imagery of being a brewster, aka the high-pointed hat, a large black cauldron, a broomstick, and their cats, were now demonized to be perceived as the signs of being a witch. The witch hunts tracked down, located, and pointed the finger at any woman who was a brewster. They accused them of being aligned with the devil and causing death and harm to the communities they cared for. It not only affected the brewsters, but all kinds of women involved in a variety of crafts, especially any woman who was accruing profit at the local market. They were all at risk of being accused of witchcraft. In Germany, women were bullied out of their guild membership. French women lost their rights to make their own contracts, and once wed, any property in their name, in addition to the women themselves, became effective immediately the territory of the man they married. There was also the influence of an increase in high demand for labor, connected to the rise of capitalism. This need directly led to the policing of women and their bodies. Those who were believed to have had sexual relations outside of those being married, and those who were directly involved in matters of contraception, such as midwives and healers in the village, became prime targets of witchcraft. Sounds frighteningly familiar to the patriarchal hunts abortion seekers and providers are faced with in this country today. As a consequence, many women were drowned, hung, and burned alive for these allegations of witchcraft made against them. By annihilating the most socially powerful women in Europe, the most powerful classes had successfully silenced the voices of women. Most people were too frightened or too powerless to rise against the capitalist patriarchy that had suddenly taken control over society, and those who dared speak were accused of witchcraft themselves. In Liechtenstein, powerful women were pointed at and accused of witchcraft so that aristocrats could rip their money away. All across Europe, women in any position of power were directly associated with the concept of being a witch. The ever-growing patriarchy essentially told all women that if they were powerful, spoke their minds, and expressed disapproval toward them or in any capacity revolted against them, they would be destroyed and murdered. Although there were variations of legislation being passed across different countries in Europe during this time, it was not until 1603 when James I's Act Against Conjuration, Witchcraft, and Dealing with Evil and Wicked Spirits was established that the definition and penalties for witchcraft were firmly planted. It included the differentiation made between minor and major offenses set in the Elizabethan period, and focused its aim on harmful and disruptive uses of witchcraft, which were directly associated with evil and the devil. One of the passages states, and I quote, "Use, practice, or exercise any invocation or conjuration of any evil and wicked spirit, or shall consult, covenant with, entertain, employ, feed, or reward any evil and wicked spirit to or for any intent or purpose, or take up any dead man, woman, or child out of his, her, or their grave, to be employed or used in any manner of witchcraft, sorcery, charm, or enchantment." Now, James I had a personal interest and investment in this definition since he had published his book, Demonology, in 1597, which was chronicled into 3 different sections. The first being magic and necromancy, the second was witchcraft and sorcery, and the third addressed spirits, ghosts, and specters. This act is deemed to be the most important in many regards because of its direct relationship with how witchcraft was defined, and its supported punishment, which perpetuated and helped fuel the infamous witch trials. Witch hunts and trials were regional, which made them challenging to gather information on, in particular the witch trials in France. France during the 15th to 18th century saw a large number of women accused of and prosecuted for witchcraft than most of Europe. In the 16th and 17th centuries, France experienced a huge spike in accusations of witchcraft when old legislation was reinstated and new methods were established to criminalize the craft. Between 1550 and 1700, there were 2,000 witch trials in the country of France alone. The concepts of demonic possession and witchcraft were closely intertwined, and who was the victim versus the villain was often blurred. One interesting case was of a young nun, Jeanne d'Ange, who was infatuated with a parish priest, Father Urbain Grandeur. 24 nuns in the form of hysterical allegations claimed that Jeanne must be possessed, and after complaints were rendered, Cardinal Richelieu ordered a witch trial of the parish priest, which culminated in Father Urbain Grandier being killed at the stake. Hysteria, panic, paranoia, and finger-pointing were the name of the game during the witch trials throughout Europe and in America. It is estimated that 50,000 people, who were mainly women, were executed in Europe during the witch trials. Discussion of the witch trials primarily centers around England and the Americas, but Italy had what is referred to as Italy's Salem, which occurred in the mid-16th century and was known as Chiora. Chiora is a tiny community in the Imperia on the Maritime Alps in Italy, with only 355 residents. Similar to how Salem portrays itself, Chiora utilizes its dark history as its primary way to identify and define itself, and thus appeal itself to tourists. The houses, streets, and alleys remain as they were since the Middle Ages, with quintessential witchy items, like broomsticks, black cats, and spooky sculptures as their decor. Between 1587 and 1589, 30 women and 1 man were held in jail accused of witchcraft. Also mirroring the origins of the Salem trials, the village accused them of using magic to induce the tragic famine that swept through their fields, and to have kidnapped and sacrificed some of the town's children. These women in particular were healers and were considered to be hermits of the town, who lived in isolation away from the rest of the community, making them easy targets to be scapegoats. They were thrown in prison in Cas de Bourgogne, which is referred to today as the witch's home, and some were moved to Genoa for trial. The prosecution claimed that these witches of Chiora met to conspire with the devil in a place called Cabotina, which exists there today. Although they were not technically executed, many died due to the brutal torture they endured. The most famous of them is the Sota Stella, whose image is represented on a sculpture in the town to commemorate her and the rest of the witches of Chiora, who were wrongfully persecuted. Another area of Italy that was affected by the witch trials lies north of Chiora in the Cuneo province of Piedmont in the small village of Roffredo. The name Roffredo is Latin for cold river and sits at the bottom of Mount Bracco. This is a much larger town in comparison to Chiora, with 1,000 people calling it home. Well known to both historians and investigators of the supernatural, this town is apparently haunted by what unfolded during a witch trial in 1495. After a man died under strange circumstances, an abbess at the local female convent believed that the devil was involved and that an inquisition should be made. Vito Beggiani was sent to the village of Piedmont to investigate her suspicions. The Masca, which is the local term there for a witch, was pointed out to be a woman named Caterina Bonavarda, which then expanded to other women whom she was acquainted with. This group of women were exposed to months of imprisonment while being tortured, which led them to confess to their involvement in witchcraft. Every October, on the last Sunday of the month, the village comes together and reenacts the historical trial to remember the victims. Near Roffredo lies the small commune of Poroldo, with only a little more than 200 people who live there. The village is laid out in a labyrinth of intricately carved alleyways, where the chapels are decorated with bizarre masks. The Masche, which is the name for the witches who have lived and practiced here for thousands of years, are believed to have shamanic powers. In this town, they are known as the Good White Witches, who were at once healers and chefs. Although most of them have since died, it is believed that they are still there, practicing and helping others, but more quietly than in previous years. An owner of the local Trattoria Tratteri recalls his experiences growing up with his own mother, who had the gift of magic healing, in the same building where his restaurant now is. The owner, M. Salvetti, is on a mission to locate the surviving Masche, so that they can come back together and preserve their ancient healing practices. These women were called upon to assist by the people of Poroldo when the more traditional ways of medicine were not helping a suffering patient. In fact, the Church of Poroldo was the center of healing, where the bells would ring each evening after the witches would complete their day of treating their patients. Their main gift was in healing skin diseases, and their powers were believed to have been carried down through the generations of women. Tradition believes that the gift was passed on by simply touching the daughter or granddaughter, but there was training also involved in order to treat people. The ritual involves the use of prayer while slicing the air 3 times with one's fingers, creating a cross near the body of the patient, but not making contact with the body. Interestingly, if there are no daughters to hand down the powers to, it was believed that the mache must pass the gift to an animal or even an inanimate object. I find the meshing of Christianity and witchcraft amongst these practitioners to be very peculiar but fascinating. In southern Italy lies the town of Benevento, which is considered the most iconic of witch villages, since unlike Chioro and Rafredo, the witches of Benevento were never persecuted. In contrast to almost all other parts of the world, including the Roma in Romania, the witches of Benevento are respected and embraced within their community, mainly because the locals were terrified of them. Benevento's strong relationship with the paranormal finds its origins back to the 6th century BC. It was during this time that the Greeks brought the cult of Cybele to these lands, which, according to legend, was the home of the Stregas, who were vampire women who had the power to metamorphosize into birds of prey and whose preference for blood was to feed on infants. The place was also intimately tied to witchcraft. The Egyptian goddess Isis was worshipped in Benevento, and the Roman Emperor Domitian sculpted a temple in her honor in 88 to 89 AD. And at the onset of the 20th century, archaeologists unearthed artifacts from the temple, like statues of priestesses. According to the 17th century historian and author Pietro Piperno, who wrote the book De Nuci Maga, regarding the magical walnut tree and its connection to the witches of Benevento, it was believed that witches from all over the world would gather at this magical walnut tree, which stood along the banks of the Sabato River. Their witchcraft is rooted within the Longobarд tradition, which involved the soldiers hanging goats or snake skins on the trees and consuming it with the purpose of acquiring the powers associated with the animals. The legend tells how this ritual would go on for multiple days, and the soldiers would dance around bonfires, celebrating with wine and women. Apparently, the bishop uprooted the walnut tree in the 7th century in the hope of repressing the pagans. According to Paperno, during the Renaissance, many powerful and famous witches called Benevento their home, including Alcina, the infamous witch on which the opera of the same name is based, who lured countless men away from their homes to be with her. On a side note, Alcina is my favorite opera, and I was blessed to watch a performance of it inside the glorious Palais Garnier Opera House in Paris. If anyone ever visits Paris, it is one of the most extraordinarily beautiful places to view, and seeing a show there is worth every penny. So it is Benevento, the home of Alcina, where it is believed that the witches would meet up at a magical walnut tree on Saturday nights, where Satan would be waiting to greet them. Local legend says that the witches of Benevento had the power to slither under the doors of their homes and cause harm to themselves and their children while they slept. This belief gave the witches the local name of Janara, which means door. There are others, though, who believe their name derives from the ancient priestess Diana, the Roman goddess of hunting and the moon, whose cult was extremely popular during ancient times. Next, we travel to the Americas, where in the early 1600s, the paranoia of women being witches took hold in New England, where the Puritans' Bible-intertwined laws made the practice of witchcraft punishable by execution. In 1647, Connecticut would be the first state where an official witch trial would take place. By 1725, more than 300 people were accused of being witches, and almost 4/5 of them happened to be women. Mirroring the same demographic of Europe's witch trials, those who were impoverished and marginalized by society were at the most risk. Any woman who dared challenge the societal norms set by Puritan beliefs, in particular women who had property or who had wealth, became prime targets of this hunt, The first person to fall victim to the witch hunts in America was Martha Carrier. Martha was sexually active, although she was not married, and became with child when she was a young woman. When her male relatives all died from smallpox, she was expected to inherit most of her father's land. She was accused of witchcraft, and when she refused to confess, she was hanged in Salem on August 19th, 1692. She would be one of over 300 people accused of witchcraft, and the first of 19 who were murdered for being accused of being a witch. Witch hunters only exacerbated the problem. Often, these men were pastors who advocated for their believers to buy into the idea that their daily suffering, their challenges, ailments, and struggles were all thanks to Lucifer. This position was recorded to have been quite influential, not to mention very lucrative. The greed induced by the demand for gold and silver among the most elite of Europe created its own witch hunts in South America at this time. Those who revolted and resisted the expansion of colonialism and capitalism were frequently tortured and murdered. In 1562, Spanish colonists in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula accused around 4,500 individuals of worshipping false idols. They were flogged in front of their communities and then enslaved those who survived the torture to mine for their treasure, so that others were shown what would happen to them if they rebelled. A Catholic council in 1567 decreed the local elimination of all witch doctors in Peru, when the Tenque Ancoy rebellion there wanted to call on the power of the Huacas, their deities, to combat Spanish rule. As a result, there was more than a century of persecution against witch doctors. In stark contrast to these circumstances, in some places in the world, witches were highly revered, respected, and admired, unlike most areas of Europe, which are known for having the highest counts of persecution of witches throughout the 15th through 18th century, with an estimated 40 to 60,000 people having been murdered. Romania remained untainted by this epidemic of violence. Witchcraft in Romania coexists with its predominant religious counterpart, being Orthodox Christianity, with more than 80% of the population identifying as such. As discussed in detail in my previous episode on exorcism and religion in Romania, there remains a strong belief in the divine there, and not just within the traditional sense of the word. What other parts of the world may deem as supernatural, beliefs in the powers of the divine, including those within the form of witchcraft, have been a long-recorded element of their culture. Viewed as divine gifts transferred to them by God, witchcraft in Romania is not synonymous with any kind of satanic or even neo-pagan beliefs, as many modern-day practitioners may connect with. Their powers are associated with females only, and it is believed that these gifts are passed down from generation to generation, exclusively from mother to daughter. Members of the Romanian witch community, also referred to as vrăjitoare, teach their daughters the craft once they turn 7 years old. Their beliefs and practices are not conducted in secret. It is not something which they have to keep hidden from society in order to protect or shield themselves from harm or ridicule. On the contrary, Romanian witches have always held great power in their community. During the 1960s, up until his execution on Christmas Day 1989, they were faced with banishment and potential imprisonment under the late communist leader, Nicolae Ceausescu. Ironically and very hypocritically, Ceausescu's own wife, Elena, had her own personal fortune teller named Mother Caterpillar. Maria Campina, an 80-year-old woman, was deemed the Queen Witch of Romania and has self-proclaimed herself as the White Magic Queen. She has created and evolved her gifts and those of her fellow witches into a very lucrative, if not controversial, business. The Queen Witch self-promotes her talents and shares their ways of life freely amongst news outlets, television interviews, and social media. Their business was so successful that the television regulator of Romania attempted to restrict their advertising on the medium, since it was being overrun by fortune-telling commercials. They find alternative ways to spread the words of their gifts, from stapling their available services on telephone poles to advertising in the local newspaper. It is estimated that the witch economy, which officially became a legal occupation in 2011, garners around $1 million each year. Prior to it being a legal profession, witches, along with fortune tellers and astrologers, of course, did not have to claim any taxes, and were thus living very lavish lifestyles. Some even lived in gorgeous, spacious houses with rooms filled with elegant furnishings and high ceilings with sparkling chandeliers. They adorned themselves in extravagant gold jewelry, and some even drive luxury automobiles such as Audis. Some witches were not exactly pleased with being faced with paying 16% income tax and being forced to contribute to health and pension plans. There were some who viewed it as an attack on the Roma population, which some still refer to as gypsies, whose primary source of income is derived from fortune-telling. The Romas, or gypsy communities in Romania, face a long history of recorded prejudice and discrimination. It is said that spells were used to combat this move by the government, with poisonous mandrake thrown by someone to the Danube River, and the queen witch at the time, Bertara Buzet, who had planned to concoct a spell comprised of cat excrement and a dead dog to curse the president and his administration. What some countries may deem to be fantasy and ridiculous to believe in the supernatural world has strong roots in Romania. One recent survey found that 2/3 of the residents of Romania believe in demons, curses, spirits, and enchantments, and 1 in 5 there believe in the powers of witchcraft. President Traian Băsescu, along with his aides, have been reported to have worn purple every Thursday to ward off evil forces. The belief in witchcraft is so ingrained in the culture and the people there that the president even passed legislation that threatened witches with fines and even imprisonment if their predictions turned out to be false. These are not witches out of fairy tales or how women were depicted during the witch trials. Roman witches are often beautiful, stylish, and crafty women who take their image as seriously as they do their work. Sometimes they are dressed in elegant, white flowing dresses, and other times in garb reminiscent of a traditional gypsy with bright colors and multiple patterns. They cast spells for love, health, prosperity, and the banishment of enemies or dark forces, including corruption in their government and throughout the world. It has been reported that they have even joined forces with witches and wizards in the United States and other countries to perform mass rituals to combat the politically corrupt. They are seen by some to be comparable to life coaches for those who seek their assistance. These women can provide guidance and help people feel they are in control over their own destinies, making them in turn feel more powerful. Some of the Roman witches have even made their way to Hollywood, establishing exclusive clientele there. They even cast spells online via Facebook to offer their services to individuals all around the world. Now, to some, this may seem exploitative of their gifts and cause some concern for the legitimacy of their services. However, when you consider the cultural status in Romania, which is viewed by a great many that they are inferior, and they are known to face great prejudice there, these women are simply utilizing technology to promote their businesses and lead prosperous lives. I cannot blame them for using what they have to make a living, and they appear to believe in the powers of what they do. It does, though, take away from the mysticism of witchcraft, when it is employed in such a manner, especially when young witches take selfies in front of their rituals. Witch trials and persecution of witchcraft are still very prominent events across many nations, especially those who are most impoverished and marginalized. The developing world is still faced with massive poverty, poor medical care, and little to no traditional forms of education, so they are the most vulnerable to being inflicted by such persecution. The United Nations is at the helm of trying to eradicate witch trials, which continue to increase around the world and are almost always enacted in a brutal fashion, sometimes even ending in the death or shall I say murder, of the accused. Just as the rise of capitalism and issues of economic inequality in Europe and America triggered a backlash against women and the poor, there is a direct correlation between the same issues and what is happening in Africa and parts of Asia in the present day. It is believed that international development policies directly led to a surge in witch hunting during the 1990s. In response to the harsh parameters of an International Monetary Fund loan made in 1981, Kenya demolished their education and healthcare by severely cutting public spending on these areas, in addition to removing price controls that had previously been set on food and other necessary items to live. This is the same time when AIDS had its largest escalation of cases in Kenya. So accusations of witchcraft became intimately connected to the people's extreme suffering. History shows that there is a strong connection between a lack of resources, little to no government support, basic human needs failing to be met, and a rise in the accusations of witchcraft. Based on research by the WHO, or the World Health Organization, almost 25% of all pregnant women in Zambia are infected with the HIV virus, and many men, women, and even children are accused of spreading the disease through witchcraft. This has led to the establishment of witch hunters, where in one town in Zambia, a witch hunter murdered 16 people suspected of witchcraft over 4 months. Similar to the witch hunters of the witch trials in New England, witch hunters are found in Malawi and Namibia today. Those who are accused of witchcraft must pay a hefty fee, sometimes up to $100, for witch hunters to determine whether or not the accused is a witch. These hunters, also called witch doctors, are all wealthy, and every single one of them is a man. In Papua New Guinea, there have been dozens of individuals murdered for the accusation of witchcraft. In 2009, a young girl was accused of being a witch, infecting men with HIV, and was subsequently burned alive. Only a month after this horrific act, a father and son were also burned to death, having been accused of witchcraft. Nigeria has also been a country inflicted with witchcraft persecution. In 2007, children accused of witchcraft were abused, poisoned, and burned. In 2008, gossip began about a successful soccer player in the Congo having used witchcraft. This led to a riot breaking out where a stampede killed 13 people. India is also one of the most dangerous places for people, but in particular women, to face accusations of witchcraft. Between 2000 and 2016, there were 2,500 reports of individuals being hunted down, tortured, and murdered because they were believed to be involved in witchcraft. India's patriarchal culture and rejection of females in power and lack of independence has laid the foundation for women to be labeled sadhakans, or witches in India. Female property owners are the main target, who have been scared out of leaving their properties due to accusations of witchcraft. In India, women who are independent and affluent enough to own land have been assaulted and bullied off of their properties with threats of violence, even murder, to which the neighboring men are more than happy to take over. Presumably, their neighbors will start by collecting pieces of firewood, with the idea that the suspected witch will be burned with the wood. This successfully scares many women to abandon their homes, which the male neighbors then happily take after they have been run off. Those who appear physically different from the majority of society are also vulnerable to being victims of witchcraft accusations. In Tanzania, there have been more than 50 albino individuals who have been murdered for ritual purposes. The witch doctors there use their skin, arms, legs, and hair in rituals for clients, believing that they hold a special magic. This level of violence based on greed and targeted prejudice against women, the poor, the disabled, the elderly, and even children has only increased since the COVID-19 pandemic, which wreaked havoc on the most vulnerable of communities. This abuse, torture, and murder of those accused of witchcraft have led the United Nations to pass a resolution that condemns anyone or any group of people who inflict harmful practices upon others that are directly related to being accused of witchcraft and ritual-based attacks that lead to human rights violations. Thanks to the brave voices of women and men affected by this violence, and organizations such as AFA, Stop Sorcery Violence in Papua New Guinea, and the non-profit women's leadership group Anandi in Gujarat, India, modern-day witch hunting is being exposed, and it will no longer be ignored. With more than 6 years of lobbying by academics, lawyers, non-government-based organizations, and a coalition of survivors of witch hunts, the United Nations in 2021 finally took steps to end this epidemic of violence. Although the traditional witch trials of Europe and America have ended, and at least on paper, we have the constitutional right in this country and in most of Europe to any expression of spirituality we wish to partake in or represent. There are still witch hunts, and practitioners of witchcraft are still often met with judgment and scrutiny. These vicious attacks on individuals accused of being involved in witchcraft are not unique to third world countries, especially by those who carried their beliefs with them to the Western world. In 2005, an 8-year-old girl in London, England, who was born on the Ivory Coast, was viciously abused by her family members, who were convinced she was a witch. Fortunately, since she was in England at the time, when authorities discovered what was happening, the child was immediately removed and her perpetrators arrested. The depiction of indigenous women in the United States is often demonized and portrayed as practitioners of dark magic. They are the targets of modern-day witch hunting with the primary purpose of stripping them of their female power and status in order to assimilate them into American patriarchal society. In the United States, there are approximately 1.5 million people who identify as witches. This group of people primarily identify as Wiccans, with around 800,000 people calling themselves as such, and the others identify as other neo-pagans, thanks in large part to the unjustified persecution and even murder of innocent women and men during the witch trials of Salem. Being hunted and harmed is not a genuine concern for practitioners any longer in this country. However, this does not mean that people don't still perceive modern-day witches as being occult or aligned with dark energies. Wiccans and neo-pagans alike are often blended in with satanic followers due to their shared use of the pentacle. Satanic believers' use of the pentagram or pentacle is distinctly different from witches, and their belief systems are quite the opposite. Wiccans and neo-pagans believe and worship in the gods and goddesses, the energies of the universe, and align with the elements of fire, earth, water, and air to manifest things in their lives and others. Some practitioners may use tools like astrology, the tarot, or divination through scrying, or some may simply light candles, meditate, and celebrate the Sabbats and Esbats. They have absolutely nothing to do with the Christian God, Lucifer, nor does it condone or advocate any kind of blood sacrifice. In fact, it is rooted in the opposite, and the main motto of it is, and I quote, "And it harm none, do what you will." Of course, there will always be some individuals or groups who choose to use their practice for darkness. This can be said for any religion or spiritual path. The youth of America, in particular millennials, have created a new boom in the interest and practice of witchcraft. By appealing to the younger generation, witches have turned to TikTok, where the hashtag WitchTalk has 31.2 billion views. Yet still, many individuals prefer to keep their faith a secret, since some still face discrimination and prejudice from many who identify as Christians and other more traditional religions. I personally believe that there were many different factors that came into play that led to the persecution and execution of women and men who had been accused of witchcraft. It is almost impossible to deny the strong connection with the rise of patriarchy and the pursuit of power and greed by elitist men who sought to silence the voices and influence of women, as well as anyone who was not deemed as part of the status quo. I hope you've enjoyed my exploration of witches around the world. I know that there are many other countries and cultures that I did not touch upon, and hopefully I can find more information to cover those in future episodes. I hope that you enjoyed this very special Halloween Witches episode as much as I was enriched by creating it for you, and that it gave you some unique insight and knowledge about witches in the past and present day that you were not aware of. What are your thoughts on the intentions and motivations behind the witch trials? Thank you so much for listening today. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I am beyond thrilled to be your host. Until next time, watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets, next door, and especially inside your own home. A Little Dogma's Shades of Murder is created, written, researched, and edited by Alita Dogma. Music courtesy of Pixabay.